Okay, now you can hear me. We're going to move into the next major topic in the course, the economics of HIV, AIDS, and spend the next few lectures on this topic. Last week we kind of wrapped up the portion on geography, health, tropical disease, and development, talking about the case of the deworming project in Kenya. So now we're going to talk about another health issue, but a very specific health issue that's very important, and almost certainly the most important single health issue or health problem in sub-Saharan Africa, which is HIV/AIDS. So to start, I want you to take out your clickers just to get a sense of your guys' views on this, and have you guys answer the following question, which is as follows. Based on the latest data, what is the prevalence, so the average infection rate with HIV in sub-Saharan Africa? 2%, 5%, 7%, 10%, 14%. Yeah, what percent? Yeah, of adults. Yeah, of adults, what percent are HIV positive? Just take another few seconds here. Yeah. Pardon? Oh no, just pretend. Just we'll know. Okay, so. Very interesting. Okay, so most people think it's 14%. A lot of people are 10% or 7%. Very few are down here. So that's really interesting. This is the right answer, actually. It's 5%. If you ask in surveys, if you ask most Africans living in sub-Saharan Africa today, they say 30% on average. So there's a perception that it's actually, even though 5%, as I'll show you on the map soon, is by far the highest in the world of any region, it's way below people's sort of views on how high the infection rate is overall in sub-Saharan Africa. So that's just an interesting starting point, and maybe we don't kind of understand everything we think we understand about HIV/AIDS in sub-Saharan Africa. Sorry, when you include North Africa? Well, if you include North Africa, it's going to go down even further. Infection rates in North Africa are much lower. So here's a world map, and you can't make all of this out. Obviously, the darker shading means there's more HIV. That kind of pink shading, like North America, is still less than 1%. It's really this kind of red and then dark red shading where the action is. So I know it's hard for you guys to see, but the red is 5 to 15%, and the very dark red is over 15%. So there's certainly are parts of Southern Africa and East Africa where you're in this 5 to 15% or even higher range, but there are large parts of Sub-Saharan Africa that are more in this that are in this 1 to 5% range. And then in North Africa, as the question just alluded to, rates are lower where there's data. In Libya, there was no data, but in the other North African countries, Middle Eastern countries, etc., actually, infection rates were much lower. Yeah. Yeah, so South Africa has some of the highest HIV infection rates in the world and higher than the sub-Saharan African average. We're going to get to that right now. The point of the lecture today, in part, is to give you guys this overview. We're going to talk about patterns, like what are just the facts about infection rates and why, and then we're going to get into impacts. But we're going to come back directly to that in a couple slides. But the Southern African region has some of the highest infection rates in the world. Can people see any other patterns that are noteworthy here? Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep. So this is prevalence, is proportion of the population that's infected. Any other questions or just observations about patterns in different regions of the world? What other regions of the world do you see some concentration of infection? Oh, you have a question? Go ahead. Yeah, I think they just grouped the whole country together. My guess is, it's probably lower there than in the rest of the U.S., but what do I know? And, here, like whole countries like China, India, et cetera, kind of lumped together. Even though there's a lot of variation actually within those countries. Lauren? Right. So you see in Russia there, for instance, there's a decent amount there. While in sub-Saharan Africa, the consensus is the vast majority of transmission is due to heterosexual intercourse. In the former Soviet Union, a lot of it is due to needle sharing among drug addicts. At least that's the conventional wisdom. Yeah. This is adults. This is infection among adults. We will, a little bit later on, we'll allude to it, but we're going to focus for the most part on adults and adult productivity. The issue of transmission to children is important. Unless pregnant mothers are given certain drugs, then there is a likelihood they would infect their own kids. But if they're treated with certain antiretrovirals at key points in their pregnancy, that massively reduces the risk of transmission. So that's become widespread to have those therapies. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Other than maybe Portugal, the U.S. is still kind of in this range, but it's higher than, say, the European average, higher than Japan and other wealthy countries. The other big concentration you see is in Southeast Asia. So Thailand, very early on, had a lot of HIV in the 1980s, and at least some of that was due to transmission through the commercial sex industry, which is huge in Thailand. So that's one of the rare sort of non-African countries where you have over 1% infection rate in the population as a whole among adults. Okay. So globally, the estimates are that over about 30 million people are infected with HIV, 2/3 of which are in sub-Saharan Africa. So that's really the focal point for the global infection. There's a number of reasons why there is a concentration in Africa. The most important reason, people seem to agree, is the virus seems to have originated in Africa, in parts of eastern Congo or the Great Lakes region of central and eastern Africa. That's where the virus came from, and the HIV virus is actually a variant of a chimpanzee virus. So one way it may have been spread in that part of eastern Congo, people actually hunt and eat monkeys that through contact with blood, basically the virus could have spread to people. And that's probably how it happened. The epidemic starts in the 1980s, the early 1980s. But once the epidemic broke out, epidemiologists tried to hunt for clues that maybe it had been around earlier. And it turns out it was around earlier. There were cases when Congo, this big country in Central Africa, was still a Belgian colony in the late 50s. There were a couple of really mysterious cases of Belgians who had gone back to Belgium and had really weird immune diseases. No one knew where they came from, and these folks died, and they said, well, they were in Congo, they must have caught something. They've gone back and actually looked at those tissue cultures. Some of them had been kept in storage and found the HIV virus. So there were cases even decades earlier, but because there were fewer of them and scientists didn't know what to look for, doctors didn't know what to look for, they went undetected really until the 80s when researchers figured out what was going on with the virus. But the origin of the virus was in basically eastern and central Africa. 60 million people have been infected since the start of the epidemic. Think about that. That's an unbelievable number. That's more than the population of France, something like that. 30 million people have died already. So this is an epidemic I think we're all aware, but when you look at the numbers, it's almost just unbelievable, the numbers that have died from the epidemic. And as we saw on the map, the highest prevalence, meaning the highest proportion of infections in the southern African countries, which, as we discussed before, actually some of the richer countries in sub-Saharan Africa. So we're going to try to understand why, basically what's going on and why. Now, you probably can't see these numbers very well. move this thing. Can you see these numbers, kind of? See it pretty well? So that's the 5% number on the top right in sub-Saharan Africa that we came to before. You can see in some of the other regions in South and Southeast Asia, it's about 0.3%. Really, in all the other world regions, it's less than 1%. In the Caribbean, it's about 1%. But sub-Saharan Africa is really the outlier with sort of an order of magnitude higher infection than the rest of the world. Okay, the only good news that we have is that the number of deaths and new infections are falling gradually. So they peaked about a decade ago, or a little more, but in the early 2000s, they were just rising and rising and rising. As someone who was doing research in the field and working in this area of health and development in Africa at the time, there was a notion like, how is this going to end? I mean, it was just getting worse sort of every year over time. A really critical part of the turnaround, or at least the dampening of the problem, has been the spread of antiretroviral therapies and drugs in sub-Saharan Africa. With those therapies, people who are infected, many of them can live. Not everybody, the therapies don't work for everybody, but most people who are regularly taking the drugs will live, at least for the medium run, if not the long run. The other advantage of using the therapies, and this is probably more important than people realize, is they reduce the viral load in people's bodies, so they become less likely to infect other people. So there's kind of, again, thinking about externalities, not only by taking the therapies am I healthier, but I'm less likely to infect other people because the viral load in my body is suppressed by the drug. So there's sort of a double benefit to the antiretroviral therapies. And this spread of antiretrovirals in itself is a really interesting story. We're not going to get into all the politics and the details here, but for a number of years, there were activist groups in the late 1990s and early 2000s that were pushing to make these ARVs available in sub-Saharan Africa because tens of millions of people were dying, and every single pharmaceutical company just fought them for years, even though they weren't really going to sell much of these drugs in Africa because the price of the antiretrovirals was very high. So it wasn't like they were going to lose market share. They were really just afraid that if drugs were sold in Africa, maybe they could be brought back on the black market to the US or other countries and sold. I think they were also just afraid of what they perceived as a weakening of their patent protections, that there was a precedent for their patents being sort of brought into the public domain to deal with this global crisis. But under very severe pressure from activist groups, politicians, Bill Clinton, Bono, people getting into the act, a mandatory licensing regime was put in place that basically led to these drugs being sold at cost in sub-Saharan Africa. So that was really a huge victory, and it was done by activist groups that were that wanted to save tens of millions of lives against pharmaceutical companies that were going to kind of stand around, honestly, and let it happen. There was really no effort on their part to deal with it, which is sad, but anyway, better policies came. In terms of the funding, even for those low-cost drugs, the country that's taken the lead on this by far, and you'll see this in the report. I put this UNAIDS report on your reader, and I only put a certain section of the report. You can find the whole report online. They tally up which countries have funded these antiretrovirals. And the US, this is like the big foreign aid success of the US of the last 15 or 20 years. In many other ways, US foreign aid has been very stingy relative to the size of our economy, but not in this case. So President Bush pushed for a massive multi-billion-dollar effort to send ARVs in massive quantities to Africa in the 2000s. So this is sort of his big foreign aid success, and he gets a lot of credit for kind of making this his cause. Without those antiretrovirals, instead of 30 million people having died, there'd be millions more who would have died. I remember when I was working, doing fieldwork on a trip in Kenya in 2003, I was in Kenya for a particular project, but I went to see a clinic in Rift Valley province in Kenya, Eldoret, which was one of the first clinics in Kenya in 2003 to have ARVs, just like regular supplies of ARVs that were going to be given at low cost. And it was sort of a miracle. There were people we were meeting who weeks earlier had literally been on their deathbed. So they only had enough drugs to treat, it was like what doctors would call triage. They only had enough drugs to treat the sickest people who were like about to die. So as people were coming into clinics in this part of Kenya, literally dying, they would start giving them the ARVs, and then they were just fine. Like a matter of weeks later, they were walking around, they were gaining weight, they were alive. It was something kind of miraculous to see. And of course, as the number of these ARVs has increased over time, a greater and greater share of the population gets access to them. So people get access to them long before they're literally on their deathbed. And that can have huge consequences. Obviously, they live, for their families, for their children, for the economy. And we're going to talk about some of those in the next couple lectures. Okay, so these are some of the numbers from the report I put on your reader. The upper left is the number of new infections globally. Again, the vast majority of those are in Africa. And you can see, in the early 2000s, it was about 3.5 million new infections annually, and now it's closer to maybe 2.5 million. So that's a lot, but it's a drop of maybe a third over a decade or so. So a big drop in the number of new infections. The numbers of AIDS deaths were sort of peaking around maybe 2003, 2004. Those have started falling as well. What you will see is the number of people living with HIV, the number of people infected, continues to rise. And this is partially due to the new infections, but it's partially due to the fact that people who are infected are living longer because they have access to the drugs. So instead of seeing this as a failure, you can see this as a success. These are people for sure who are able to live because they have access to these drugs. Okay, another clicker question. I just want to kind of get some of the stylized facts on the table. So here's the question. Is prevalence of HIV in sub-Saharan Africa, this is in sub-Saharan Africa, higher among women, higher among men, roughly equal, nobody knows, somebody knows but I don't know, that's E, which is a totally legitimate response if you want. Please don't Google it during the question period. Give me your answer. I know we could all Google it, but maybe too tempting. I understand. Okay, so very interesting. Roughly, you guys sort of roughly equal numbers say it's women or men. A bunch say it's equal. There are far more HIV infections among women in sub-Saharan Africa than men. So this is the reverse again of the pattern during the epidemic in the U.S. in the 1980s and early 90s. The focal point for that epidemic was the gay male community in the U.S. So infection rates were much higher among men than among women in the U.S. Although it's become much more generalized in the U.S. since then. But it's not the case in sub-Saharan Africa. So here's the data. And these are just from that report. I've sort of labeled the different regions, central, east, southern, west. And then the gray lines are women's infection rates. The blue lines are men's infection rates. And those are their infection rates over time. So this is kind of a neat figure. You can see the changes over time. There's a few patterns in this figure. One, infection rates seem to be falling over time. Some of that is due to people having died who were infected. Others is due to sort of fewer numbers of new infections. So it's a combination of those two. You see that drop over time. But you see, for instance, in southern Africa, women are about twice as likely as men to be infected. So it isn't like it's kind of close. Like women are much more likely to be infected. And you see a similar pattern in West Africa, in Eastern Africa, and in Central Africa. Everywhere, women are more infected. Yeah. Yeah, here, sorry, I should have said, these are among young adults, and I'll give you data among sort of a larger range of adults in a little bit. These are all young women, married or unmarried. So some of these are based on surveys that are meant to be representative of all, the whole population. So you can see these kinds of patterns. Yeah. Yeah, so it's an interesting question. There's a number of reasons. First is there's a lot of misconceptions about risk of transmission during sexual intercourse. So the first misconception is I think a lot of people, and part of this is due to the public health campaigns in Africa, a lot of people think that from any one act of sexual intercourse, say vaginal sexual intercourse, that would very likely lead to infection from, say, between two partners. But the likelihood of infection for vaginal intercourse, the estimates at least, are that they're much less than 1% per episode of vaginal sexual intercourse. So there's this sort of the likelihood of transmission isn't like 1, it isn't 50%, it's much less than that. So that just means partners who are together can have a different status. There's a researcher at the World Bank named Damien Devalk, who's been collecting data across African countries on this, and he finds huge numbers of what he calls discordant couples. So married couples who are regularly having sexual intercourse, where the husband and the wife have different HIV status, and they're just not infecting each other. Of course, sometimes people do infect each other. That's how we get the spread of the disease. But you can have this kind of discordance. There's also, I think, accepted wisdom that in vaginal intercourse, the likelihood of infection is much higher from males to females than the reverse, due to the nature of vaginal sexual intercourse. So that's another reason why women may have higher infection rates than men in this setting. So there's a couple of reasons why this may be the case. If you look at numbers of partners, this is a little bit surprising because in a lot of the African data, men claim to have more partners than women in the surveys on average. So you might think men would be more likely to be infected. Now there's issues with that. Like when they've tried to do really in-depth studies in the US, they sometimes find in certain surveys women understate the number of partners they have, certain men overstate the number of partners they have. Obviously, that wouldn't happen here. But basically, we don't know for sure how many partners people have. But our best guess is maybe men on average have somewhat more partners. Despite that, women have higher infection rates. But that's because of the nature of vaginal intercourse. Yeah. Yeah. So there's been a lot of effort on circumcision to limit the risk that especially in some cases men face. There's like the mechanics of transmission during intercourse, and circumcised males, all the studies suggest circumcised males are much less likely to get infected or transmit infection than uncircumcised males. So there's been programs to promote circumcision in many parts of sub-Saharan Africa to try to reduce transmission. So that's something that can be done. It's a public health measure. Now that's not a trivial thing to implement culturally. In many parts of sub-Saharan Africa, there are either very strongly held cultural norms in favor of circumcision or against circumcision. And so sometimes you have to fight against those cultural norms to promote circumcision. But there have been randomized controlled trials showing that circumcised men, where they basically pay men to get circumcised and then find that they're much less likely to be infected several years later than the uncircumcised men. Yeah. So you're saying what is the cost? So the cost has fallen a lot. There's probably a cost of a couple $100s a year at this point, including the drugs and the sort of clinic time for people on ARV, something on that order of magnitude. Now remember, per capita income in many African countries in foreign exchange rate terms could be $400 or $500 a year. So $200 a year is a lot of money in that context, but it does mean these individuals can live. So it's something that the international community and governments have made a priority. But it's not cheap in local terms, $200. Yeah. There's huge variability, and some of that we could think of as cultural, and others we could think of as a result of policy. So there's the case. There are different countries with very different policies towards HIV. Uganda became very famous in the 1980s and early 90s for being very progressive on its HIV/AIDS policy, talking about it on the radio, lots of public service announcements, free condom distribution, and very frank sexual education to try to reduce the spread of the epidemic. Whereas in neighboring Kenya, when I was working in neighboring Kenya in the late 90s, there was almost none of that. Now Kenya changed a little bit later, but Kenya was much more conservative. A lot of church groups were trying to block a lot of the discussion of a lot of the sexual behavior issues, etc. But in Uganda, not so much. In fact, Busia, Kenya was an interesting place to see this difference because it's right on the border. You guys saw the maps. Like where we were working was on the border. In fact, Busia town, the district capital, is split by the border. There's Busia, Kenya, and Busia, Uganda. You can kind of walk back and forth. So we could listen to both Kenyan radio and Ugandan radio. So in the late 90s, every fourth ad in Uganda would have something to do with a public health message, HIV, and there was zero of that in Kenya. So policies can change attitudes and practices, and that's part of the story. So I think part of it can be certainly cultural, but part of it is influenced by public policy. There's a very famous case you guys may have read about of the president of South Africa shortly after that, Thabo Mbeki, the president who took over from Nelson Mandela, who was basically like an HIV/AIDS skeptic, who was sort of doubting the link between the virus and the disease, or saying maybe there were other factors, and that really slowed down the response to HIV/AIDS in South Africa, which had some of the highest infection rates. So leadership and policy mattered a lot for dealing with the epidemic. Okay, so what are we going to talk about? Today we're going to talk about the extent of the problem. We're going to continue that discussion, and then we're going to get into this point 1 on impact with the Fox et al. Article, which is on your reader, and we'll probably continue that on Tuesday, and then we're going to get to this question of why it continues to spread, and we'll put up a simple sort of economic model of decision making and see how far it can take us in helping us understand the decision of whether or not to have risky sex. And the question there is, in a context where there is a lot of infection and a lot of people dying, why are there still 2.5 million infections a year? What's going on to lead to the continued spread of the epidemic? And then, once we understand 0, 1, and 2, there'll be some implications for 3, and I've already discussed some of them. We just talked about maybe public health campaigns and other messages being part of the solution, condom distribution, etc. So we'll kind of go through a list of the 7 or 8 policies that are often advocated, and I'll give you guys a little bit of a rundown of what some of the research evidence says about them, some of which will be in the Thornton piece. Any questions at this point? Or comments? Okay. So let me get to some detailed data from Kenya, where I know the data pretty well, and also because it's an interesting data story. Around 2000, 2001, 2002, the estimates that were being put out by this United Nations agency that tracks the spread of the epidemic, UNAIDS, was that the infection rate among adults in Kenya was probably about 15%. That was the number that was being thrown around. And the estimated numbers in southern Africa that were being thrown around was more like 30%.